Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you.
सोचो अगर बचपन से ही भागना पड़ जाए, अपनों का ही डर सताए। ये सब नजर का ही तो खेल है, कहीं किस्मत ही ना पलट जाए।
थैंक यू चाचू।
Countless young lives bear the scars of unspeakable acts, yet many of them stay hidden in the shadows forever. According to the 2020 data of the National Crime Records Bureau, NCRB, approximately 28.9% of the entire child population in India has experienced some form of sexual crime, yet only 65.6% of these are ever reported. Another survey conducted by the humanitarian aid organization World Vision India revealed that 1 in every 2 children is a victim of child sexual abuse. And the haunting silence that shrouds their pain, over 90% of these abusers are individuals whom children know, love, and trust.
Why do you think that in 97% of the cases, like you told me, the perpetrator is a known person to the child?
Multiple reasons. One is access to the child, right? Because often we talk about stranger danger. There's so many conversations that we have with young children in terms of don't talk to anyone who is outside the family, do not take anything from them. But these conversations are less often had with terms of family members as well. So one is about access. Second is when you have someone from the family, there is also a lot of trust in that person as well. And it's okay to leave the child alone with certain family members apart from the primary caregivers. And especially in our families where you may have grandparents, uncles, aunts, other people as well as extended family and relatives, easy access and the trust is very high. This also becomes very possible for the people who are perpetrating violence to understand the child and child's needs. So they understand, okay, this child has this particular need and they start fulfilling that need as well. So we also talk about grooming in this case, which is again becomes very easy for people who come from the family itself. So for example, how do they target a child? This child is someone who is low self-worth, or this child is in need of, say, more money, or they have this favorite character, or they like certain things, maybe certain jewelry, certain comic books, and then they start giving them with those gifts. And they also become the go-to person. And because they understand the family dynamics also, sometimes, I know they don't understand you, I know they had a fight with you, they called you out yesterday, I know you were very hurt, and the child feels that, this person gets me, they understand me, and they tend to become very vulnerable and start trusting them as well. And very gradually then they start sexualizing the relationship because they have easy access. It's not a one-time thing.
People are very comfortable with mixing love with abuse. So it is, I abuse you because I love you, and so I control you, and it's very normalized. So what I find is that it's a very gray area. Earlier, teachers would hit you and it was absolutely acceptable. Parents would hit you both in the name of controlling you and also teaching you. We've come a long way on child rights, and there have been many conventions on child abuse and how it's not okay, and agency of children. So currently we have a lot of laws to deal with child abuse. We have the Juvenile Justice Act, which talks about how any abuse on children, whether physical, verbal, emotional, is not okay, and it puts the responsibility on the stakeholders. The stakeholders being parents, the teachers, the school, institutions that the child goes to. So one of the things that communities and schools, especially because that's a really big community that children are in, we have something called the Child Protection Policy, and it's a wonderful document. It's not a law, but it's a document which guides school of what they need to do in order to protect children and even not be negligent, so that children are protected, cared for, nurtured for their growth.
In Maharashtra, there is this compensation scheme called the Manodhairya Victim Compensation Scheme. Now, this particular scheme, the compensation scheme called the Manodhairya Victim Compensation Scheme, that scheme is to give financial assistance, compensation to victims of rape, victims of acid attack, and victims of POXO, which means the child victims who have been sexually violated, and rape victims, of course. So ये compensation की जवाबदारी, and if you look at the Manodhairya scheme, the scheme is very clear. The award of compensation is not dependent on the outcome of the trial, which means even if the trial results in an acquittal, which means the perpetrators do not get punished or convicted, the victim is still entitled to compensation provided the victim supports the investigation. Matlab, the victim says that she has been violated, who has violated, and she's consistent to the prosecution case. So these things are there. So all well-intended instruments, provisions are there on paper.
If you look at our law and if you look at the POXO Act in many ways keeps the child at the center of the intervention. So you have a lot of child enabling provisions within the POXO Act, right? So, for example, a child should not be called to a police station. A child's statement can be recorded at a place of his or her choice. The police officer cannot be in uniform. Or if you move to a court setup, the evidence of a child has to be recorded within a particular time frame. A child cannot be subjected to aggressive cross-examination. So there are various beneficial provisions that are included in the POXO Act.
The Protection of Children from Sexual Offences, or the POXO Act, enacted in India in 2012, is a vital legal framework aimed at shielding children from sexual abuse. Categorizing offences into sexual assault, sexual harassment, and child pornography, the law requires mandatory reporting. Anyone with information about such offences is legally obliged to report promptly. Reporting becomes a vital step in breaking the cycle of abuse and ensures timely intervention to provide necessary support for the affected children.
Overall, when you talk about procedures, I think the POXO Act in that sense is robust. The problem again comes back to implementation. I think implementation of provisions that are child enabling is completely lacking. Infrastructure for that implementation is also lacking. And when you talk about child protection systems, authorities that are set up specifically for children, those authorities lack the infrastructure that is required. So for example, child welfare committees, the district child protection unit.
But reporting is important. It's important because I have spoken to victims who have never reported sexual abuse, and many years later they still carry that feeling that I was sexually abused as a child and nobody supported me, nobody believed me, and that is more traumatic than anything else that you have to go through when you report. So I would advise somebody to validate them and to bring it to the forefront. You are not at fault. Somebody else has done this to you, and we need to remove that shame of where sexual abuse becomes almost it's your fault that this has happened to you. So things like, what were you wearing, why were you walking at night, why did you go to that place, why did you go into that website? So constantly victim blaming is what we have to address and focus more on the accused, more on the abuser, and talk about what they are doing wrong.
I think raising awareness about child abuse, before that, what we need to raise awareness about is understanding sex and sexuality. Because you cannot be talking to children about abuse, cannot be the beginning of a conversation when it comes to sex and sexuality. And the fact that nobody in our country, my parents, their parents, your parents, I don't think anybody speaks to their children about the fundamentals of sex and sexuality. Understanding their bodies, understanding their feelings, understanding who they are. Without that, if you start educating children only about, oh, these are safe touches and unsafe touches, oh, this is confusing, I just think it's going to be a society that is more tilting towards a fear-mongering sort of an approach.
Younger children, there will be always some changes in behavior. So in terms of social emotional aspect as well, there could be perhaps acting out, a lot of anger outbursts, interpersonal issues. Suddenly there are a lot of complaints about the person is hitting the other person, not interacting. And again, it's very important to note that these are changes in behavior. It's not that how a child is typically is. There could be drop in grades, drop in performance. It also can happen the other way around. I've had clients who started, the way of dealing with it was by throwing themselves into studies, and they suddenly became very high achievers and high performers. So because that was their way of distracting themselves and cutting out that noise completely. So any change that we're talking about, so in terms of grades, performance, behaviors, there could also be regression as well. Like some children start bedwetting, fecal soiling, that starts taking place as well. There could be self-harm behaviors, so their children start cutting themselves. I've had clients who would start cutting themselves on their thighs because that area is not seen usually, and they don't want to draw attention, but that's the way of numbing their emotional pain. A lot of eating disorders that are seen as well, that we see. So children start, could be bulimia, anorexia, so a lot of eating disorders that we have seen there. And when you look at older children, it could be either internalized or externalized. So internalized would be, they could result in depression, anxiety, like I said, self-harm behaviors that could happen. Externalized would be a lot of acting out, a lot of issues that may be having in their relationships. Sometimes they start having these conversations which are not age appropriate, really sexualized as well. Like there was this one person, client, where she was being abused by one of the relatives in the family, and she started sexually fantasizing all the men in the family. So those kind of impact can also happen. Another person started dressing very shabbily, would not take baths so that they smell, so that may also ward off the perpetrators. So those kind of scenes that we have seen, and how they are coping with it in terms of how to protect themselves as well.
So one, I think, common thread across cases is when an episode of abuse happens and the disclosure happens, the life of the victim, the life of this child is completely thrown off her normal routine. And if you look at children usually thrive in routines, right? They have the sense of comfort and they have a sense of, I'm okay when there is a set routine. An episode like abuse, as traumatic as it is, it throws this child completely off the routine. In many cases, we see that victims have had to vacate their households, they've had to vacate their communities because the perpetrators are living either within or, in and around. Almost in all cases, we see that there is educational loss. Again, if the victim is from a lower socioeconomic background, definitely there is an education loss, not being able to consistently go to school, the stigma, the shame. I think a lot, the odds are just like completely stacked up, against the victim. In terms of examples, I think there are a couple of examples I'd like to give you. One, case of a extremely small child, about 6 and a half, 7 years old, who was a victim of a very brutal episode of sexual violence. Comes from a underprivileged background, single parent, not many resources. Now, if you looked at this child, this child had to undergo 3 to 4 surgeries post the abuse, right? So there was a complete derailment of her physical health, of her mental health. Almost 9 to 10 months, this child had to be in and out of the hospital, which meant she couldn't go to school. This child who was perfectly walking and talking before, after the abuse, had severe physical impairment. So had to undergo physiotherapy, had to undergo still recovering actually. So in a nutshell, there was a before abuse and there's an after abuse.
If you are a pedophile, those track records should be with us. Those should go. Nowadays you have the Aadhaar. So why don't we have a database of all the people who are pedophiles? Don't let them come near children. So that will also reduce what their access is to children. And also I feel that, these pedophiles, there's a special place in hell for them, but make this life also hell for them. Your children are really just dependent on you. They just do what you want them to do. They don't know anything. And to sexually abuse a child, for me, it is an unpardonable act. Forget the sin part of it, that is all moral, but it is just an unpardonable act, and I think our law should be more stringent. And I think recently also in Punjab and Haryana High Court, I think they've taken one section of law where they've given the death sentence for raping a 5-year-old child. So I think all these harsh measures, and also there must be societal ostracism. You can't just say ki, it has happened, let's forget about it. And no, they must be socially ostracized. So I think, one thing you had asked, what are the improvements? It's not only the legal system, it's a socio-legal empowerment which will bring about a change. And I always say in countries like India, social ostracism plays a very big role in your life. So if you have social ostracism combined with this, it will have a detrimental effect on the pedophile, and it may, I always use the term may because you can't predict, but at least the probability is high that it may act as a deterrent.
So one would be, if the child does disclose, it's very important that we do not dismiss it. It has to say that I believe you, and also to keep on reiterating that you're not at fault, because often children also internalize that fear, shame, guilt. Did I do something? Perhaps why did the person really behave? Was I giving those kind of signs as well? Why me? Am I cursed? Perhaps because I misbehaved and this is why this person behaved with me. Because in some societies and culture, there's also a concept of corrective rape that happens. Also very important that we only say things that we can uphold. Because we need to understand, when there is any kind of abuse or harassment takes place, the child's trust has been broken. So if we overcommit to the extent say that, we'll ensure this person is put behind bars, we'll ensure they learn a lesson, we'll ensure that you'll never meet this person again, we don't know that. So we'll try our best to support you, we'll try our best to take care of you, we'll try our best to do what we need to do. So saying things that we can uphold becomes very important, because we don't want the trust to be broken in those cases. Also, before we start talking to the child, I think it's very important for adults to process their own feelings. Because like I said, when we hear about this, it can result into a lot of anxiety, a lot of fear, anger, guilt that I couldn't protect my child, right? This was happening right under my nose and I didn't see it. And we can feel so much guilt. So it's very important that we also take the time out to process this.
What is the message that we want to give? I think that's the question that we need to ask, right? What is the message that we want to give? Because there was an entire journey that we have had where people said, chupi todo, break the silence, come out, speak about it, me too, speak about it. And I think that messaging was loud and clear. One has to think what happens after the silence is broken. So you're telling children to break the silence, and then once they break the silence, you're not able to provide them with any support, right? Or very minimal support. So I think the question that needs to be asked is, A, what is the message, right? And I would say the biggest message has to be targeted at our men and boys. Because unfortunately, the data tells us that majority of these crimes are perpetrated by men and boys. Boys are also victims of sexual abuse, but the perpetrators are majority men and boys. So how are we going to cater if we only keep talking about abuse in the context of women and girls, right? So I think it's time to really talk to men and boys in a way, culturally make it nuanced in a way where we are able to tell them, how do you go about exploring your sexuality in a safe manner? How do you go about doing these things in a safe manner? Law is a part of it, right? आपको फांसी हो जाएगी, आपको सूली पे चढ़ा देंगे. अगर इससे लोग अब्यूज करना बंद कर देते, तो I think we would have, it was a utopian world. India में तो we would have been in some other planet only. ऐसा नहीं होता है, right? So at a fundamental level, teaching a boy how to break up, right? Teaching men about controlling their sexual urges, teaching them about consent.
कहाँ जा रहे हैं चाचू?